So today on Deep Thoughts, we're going to talk about something very important as I finish the last inch of the cigar. And it's called thought police. It's been going on for a really long time. It goes by many names and many rituals and many practices. And fortunately, the very best of us are still falling victim to it. But it will be the end of this phase of society if we can't kill it. Because we are being reprimanded for thinking. We're being reprimanded for searching for answers. And there's a ridiculous level of reprimanding simply for existing. I think you're familiar with probably the basics, which is something called political correctness, which by any other name is called censorship. And I think that someone needs to call it out all in one bundle. Because a lot of us criticize, political correctness because we're sick and tired of it. And then we have subjects that we're not allowed to discuss, which is absurd. And I'm going to go through some examples that are extremely touchy. And this is not a video about what I believe or what you believe necessarily. It's about the mechanisms of how we develop our beliefs based on this bullying. There's all these anti-bully acts and hate crime acts and all these other laws, but there's no laws going after people that are bullying our thoughts, which I think is very interesting. There's complete organizations devoted to bullying society into believing certain things. And we're not allowed to even ask the question. And this has to come to an end, at least among us, right? And to the degree you think you can share this sort of philosophy with somebody else, I would say do it. Because we need to start exposing the lunacy of thought police. And I'm going to get at the dangers of thought police right away. Political correctness is where it started for me, at least as far as I can tell. Now, this bullying of consciousness started before I was born, right? But political correctness was something that kind of emerged out of the 70s and 80s, mostly in the 80s. And what it does is extremely dangerous to the mind because we talk about the really bad politicians and really bad human beings in the world, the nefarious, the people that are trying to repress us. And they coined a phrase of doublespeak. And usually this is an answer from a politician where they are asked a very blatant question about what they believe about something controversial, perhaps abortion or gay rights. And they will invariably answer the question for and against within one answer, which is what is kind of a basic definition of doublespeak. You're no longer taking a position. The people that want to hear what they want to hear always hear what they need to hear within your doublespeak answer. So the people that are against are saying, well, he didn't quite say he was for, and the people that are for it are like, see, he didn't quite say he was against. It's a technique for the masses, for the sheep of the world, to think they've heard what they need to hear. But when we allowed that to come down to political correctness, I'll give you a couple mechanisms that are very important to prevent occurring in your mind. Now, our brain develops patterns of operation. We form a thought, and there are synaptical patterns in our brain that allow that thought to be constructed. And when we allow barriers to be built up, almost like a maze with the mouse running through it, and we're the mouse, or our thought is the mouse going through this maze. Anytime we have a thought, we want to have the most thorough, pure, unobstructed thought so that we can see all sides of the equation before we actually come to the end and decide where we want to be in the maze in terms of our conclusion. Now, again, we might be for something, we might be against something, or we might end up uncertain about something. But what political correctness does is it teaches you to lie to yourself. And what do I mean by that? When I was young, someone who had developmental problems mentally was retarded. And I'm sure that me just saying that word made a few of you cringe inside. The kid's retarded. Now, you're not allowed to say that. They're mentally handicapped or some other derivative of retarded. But we've allowed people to make that word offensive. Yet it still has the same exact meaning as any other derivative you might come up with. Whether or not you try to soften it out, it still is a retarded child. Now, the reason why that might have offense for you, and I have a bit of that myself when I say the word, because I don't use it very often, is that if you take your car in and you adjust the timing on your timing belt in your car, they will retard the signature sometimes to slow it down to match up with your the timing of your pistons going up and down. And that use of the word is actually very scientific. It just means slow down or to slow down. A person who's mentally handicapped sometimes has a retarded nature of thought. They don't process things as quickly as we do. Now, some kids are way on the other side of that fence, right? Your autistic children, the truly autistic kind of savant kids, they are thinking 50 times as fast as we are, and so you wouldn't use that word for them. But the problem is that if you know the definition of a word, which thankfully the vocabulary in America has gone down considerably, I'm joking, the word retarded actually has a meaning. That's exactly what you're trying to say. By denying that word its definition and its use, and trying to say the kid is not retarded, he's just slow, your brain has created a doublethink mechanism where the true definition of the word is being denied inside your mind, and some synonym, some alternate exact definition word is being used in its place. And so your brain is trying to resolve the conflict that these two words mean the exact same thing, and one has been demonized for some reason. I don't think the subconscious, by any stretch of the imagination, which might just be the conduit to the soul, who knows that word is just fine. And that it was through Hollywood, television, where the word was abused in an abusive manner, starts to be denied. And you got to move on to another word. What I find just interesting about political correctness, and I made an analogy in an essay, is that if I were to sit across the room with you and say I was the PC police, right, the political correctness police, and you use a word today that's acceptable for one of these areas that's policed, say let's just continue with people that may be mentally slow, and you use the word retarded, and I say, hey, that's not allowed anymore, you stop using that word, and you're a bad person all of a sudden for using that word ever. Well, one, you judge yourself right away. You know, my God, I used a word, I'm offensive, I'm a bad person. And then secondly, you start to try to reconstruct in your mind, well, geez, they really are. I got to use this other longer phrase to somehow make the person feel better, who probably doesn't know I'm saying it anyway. And again, it's always intent that makes a word bad or good. I always say, if someone offends you, it's always the intent of their offense that should really matter. And that's in a perfect world, of course. But once they allow us and convince us, to start double speaking our own brain, then we got a big problem on our hands, because then reality itself starts taking this contradictory, tough path of trying to be either real or not real, true or not true. How can you form an opinion of reality when every cornerstone of reality is disputed based on the nomenclature, the words that you put forth to describe it to yourself? And again, PC-ness is a virus. It's a fungus that grows over language. It demonizes words that were just fine because you never intended to use it in a negative way. The only way I've ever used the word retarded in a negative way is to describe something that has nothing to do with actual human beings or mentally handicapped beings. It was always something was stupid. And that's just a kind of a weird slang version of it. Like a game is retarded because it's no good, that sort of thing. Now, the other thing about PC people, political correctness police, aka thought police, is they don't really have a life of their own. It used to be when I was a kid, the PTA mothers of the world, the ones that actually, supervised your school and things, these were people that didn't really have much else in life. They didn't develop any hobbies. They didn't develop any other mechanism to value themselves. And so what they did was they externalized this authority model where they could say, I get to decide what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And you get these people in all kinds of different foo-foo little organizations like your homeowners association, someone getting to decide how many blades of grass you have on your yard, how many weeds you have, all that kind of stuff. But what they did was they added value to themselves because they go, I know rules, and that gives me value. And so they impose all the rules and this authoritarian feeling because they've been the subject of authority their entire life, which is how they've become this person without anything going on in their life. And so they push that stuff on us, and it gives them some sort of value. And so these are the vultures of reality. These are the people that are parasitically killing the ability to think. But what started as a couple words being policed has turned out to be a mechanism by which repression is out of utter control. Now let's get into some examples, and I'm going to start from some simple examples and go to the more, burning furnace examples of where we're not allowed to even contemplate certain alternate truths or even just examine what we've actually been taught as kids. Right now, there's a lot of talk about global warming, which has now been changed to climate change because global warming is not what's actually occurring. So anything that happens in the world, cold or hot, they want to take 100% advantage of your complaining about the weather regiment that you're raised with. If you get inside the climate change people, you typically have to, unfortunately, hang out with people that have done absolutely no independent research on climate change. What you're supposed to do is listen to Al Gore, who said that a giant portion of the coastline was going to be underwater by 2010, who bought a house on the coast of Montecito that would be underwater. If you watched his November 2006 movie, where he lives today would have been underwater had any of his predictions remotely been true. But none of that's true, and none of it's occurring. But right now, there's a gigantic portion of the world population who are often skilled in one area that has nothing to do with climatology. And they sort of have that God syndrome that doctors get, which is that they're good at everything without doing much effort. Because now they put all their effort into whatever they're good at. And now they think, well, obviously I know all about climate change because I read a couple of these, climate change sponsored articles. And you have to understand that climate change is all based on a goal of reducing world population growth. Because the ruling class of the world are now scared that there's too many people on Earth and they won't be able to control us and keep their power over us. And there has been an exponential curve in the growth of population on the world since oil became readily available in the early 1800s, meaning we could move all over the world. And so we obviously populated. Now, as we say on this show, if you ever fly in the air and look down, you'll understand how minuscule the population of Earth is. Now, we don't want a Borg planet either. It's completely covered in machines and cement. But what they're trying to do is turn on carbon taxation, which will make it very expensive to have children. And so they're pushing this agenda in order to reduce world population through carbon taxation. Al Gore, who's a member of Blood and Gore, believe it or not, how gross is that? He's going to be servicing those carbon debts, and his family will be indispensably wealthy as soon as this starts to become a tax that you see in your bills every month, right? So this is something that we need to think about. This is something that we need to do research on, and once you research the atmosphere, you'll realize that CO2 is so minuscule up there that you couldn't find the CO2 if you needed to. If I gave you a penny and said cut out of this penny the amount that is CO2 in the atmosphere, you would have to get a microscope and just nib off the smallest possible, part of the zinc-copper combination that is the CO2 layer. It's 0.054% of the entire atmosphere. What makes us hot? Water. 99.9% of what's in the sky that makes you hot is water. And that's why in Los Angeles right now we've got a lot of moisture over us and our temperatures are 10 degrees over. It's just pure humidity. Those who live in Houston, Texas, know all about it. So how on earth could they get us to lie to ourselves? How could they get us to swallow all this information about climate change without anyone doing any research? And that's because there's a bullying organization that's being fueled by billions and billions of dollars because it's worth trillions and trillions of dollars and decades, if not centuries of repression if they could ever turn the thing on. But it's all this PC-ness that's stacked up prior to turning on climate change discussions that's allowing the mechanism inside the mind to accept this without any research, right? Here on the show, we always say, the least researched human being on any subject is considered in our world the biggest authority, right? The less you've researched something, the more you can just walk in a room and say, bully, 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 I'm right. And that's how it works. So that's sort of a medium version of the PC collective getting their way and bullying us into something that really, really matters in this world. That's why I wanted to start off with that one. But there are tons of them. There are absolutely tons of these subjects out there that we're not allowed to discuss. And you'll know you're in a good, hot area, meaning important area or deceptive area, that when you start asking questions in that area, you start getting name-calling back. Knee-jerk name-calling, usually supported by a small group of scientists that actually devoted their entire life to it and never asked a question about it. They get their accolades by memorizing and repeating what they were told. And then you get the masses that don't want to believe that they've been had. And so that mechanism between those two contribute to this overwhelming bullying force that keeps us from ever exploring thoughts. And in the end, if you believe that something was true, you don't worry about it. As I said in a previous essay, if somebody said that your name wasn't whatever your name is, and you've seen your birth certificate, and you know your parents, and you have the whole story how they picked your name, you wouldn't get terribly angry at the person saying that your name isn't what it is. You just laugh at them and look at them like, wow, what's wrong with this person that they are telling me that I'm not who I am? It's weird, right? But when someone starts going at one of your belief systems that you've perhaps built some pride on, us going to the moon is a really tough one for people to question, although it's becoming a little less tough as time passes and NASA's completely exposed the fact that we didn't go to the moon, even though they won't connect the two dots together, right? They've got a program called Project Orion that's testing out the Van Allen belts because they're so absolutely deadly that no astronaut could have ever gone through them without dying, which means going to the moon would have been absolutely impossible with human flesh. But they took pride in that history, right? No matter if you're Czechoslovakian or American, there's a bit of human pride that's built up behind the notion that man went to the moon. We did that. Humans did that. We figured out how to get up there and land on the moon and come back safely 6 times. But once you have an open mind, all of a sudden, anything's possible. All of a sudden, the history that you're taught as a kid, anything that you're taught as a kid, comes into question. And if you're a truther, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? We have all of these false flags that are happening across the world, massacres. Thankfully, a lot of them didn't actually occur. It's all just a big PR stunt. We find the crisis actors, meaning actors that appear in each one of the different false flags, and they're playing an attorney one day and a mother the next day and a witness the next day. We have friends that have actually met these people and had discussions with them. But we wouldn't have been able to see them had we not had an open mind. If you listen to the press or you listen to someone, again, name calling, which is a scare tactic to get you to go back in on your own mind. And really, if you think about this in some sort of physical sense, some physical model sense, if your brain was sort of a Swiss watch, it's beautifully balanced and it's working perfectly when you're born, each time someone asks you to deny the truth, be it political correctness, which is meaning you can't use a word anymore that was perfectly suited for the description, then you're kind of going in and you're jabbing a screwdriver into the cogs and the wheels in your mind. You're destroying something inside that Swiss watch so it no longer operates properly. But it's so beautifully damaged that it becomes a functioning watch, but it's just wrong all the time. The time inside your head isn't right if it was a watch, So I want to make sure that when you accept someone bullying you, that you understand you're damaging your mind. You're actually damaging the operational ability of you to conceive of what's going on around you. Now, I'm going to get into some really tough areas, and we did this once on an episode that I pulled. We did an episode where we touched the Holocaust for a split second, and I pulled it because we didn't plan on talking about it. I just threw it out there to prove that there's thought police. And I think that we covered some areas a little flipped that are very serious subjects to discuss. So I'm going to take this very seriously in this particular deep thoughts. And again, this is not about what I believe and what you believe and that kind of stuff. This is about keeping an open mind and being able to look at the facts of things. But I'm going to go through the Holocaust with you just briefly to prove to you that you have it built into you already. If you're a normal human being, you have built-in denial through a lifetime of total repression of this being anything other than what you were told. And, I wasn't there. So all I'm going to do is tell you what some people have said that seems to make a heck of a lot of sense and doesn't seem to have any necessity to have a scientific degree to prove it or not, right? Now, we are told that 6.2 million Jews died as a result of concentration camps and mainly the assassination of essentially half the world's population of Jews in Europe during the Nazi occupation. And we have photographs of giant piles of bodies, mass graves. We have photographs of, trucks full with these bodies. We have videos of, hundreds of POWs that are, scrawny, really, really thin. And so we have a lot of visual evidence to prove that a tremendous number of people did die as a result of these concentration camps. And here on MK Ultra, what we'd like to say is that's a Holocaust all by itself. What we have seen in photographs is good enough to say that some horrific thing did occur. Now, in terms of the actual numbers, it's probably drastically different. There's a Catholic priest out there, and I forget his name, but he has done a couple videos where, again, he wasn't kicked out of the Catholic Church for saying these things. So I want you to keep that in mind. The Catholic Church has been linked heavily to securing the treasures of the Nazis, the money, the gold, all those gold fillings that supposedly were taken out of people. They harbored that cash and laundered it back into the people that confiscated it. And that's sort of above ground knowledge about what they've done. So this Catholic priest who actually publicly talked about some of the scientific anomalies with the story versus the claims, or I should say the reality of what's possible in the story, he was never kicked out of the church. And he completely denies, I guess I would say, about 6 million of the Jews out of the 6.2 million. He pretty much comes to a number just shy of 300,000 people. And what he did was he broke down the actual camps themselves that were said to have these gas chambers where people were hoarded into these buildings and supposedly given a derivative of cyanide gas. And so when you first hear that, your brain goes, no way. Absolutely no way is there any doubt that that is 100% real. And then you start looking at some of the published evidence leading up to the Holocaust. And there's a very interesting video we posted on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/MKUltraRadio. Where starting in 1918, these articles started getting published in newspapers in New York City, all the way up to 1938, before Hitler really ever rose up and had any great power, that 6 million Jews, just an absolutely round number, which again accounted for half the population of Jews on planet Earth, were being persecuted. And you hear this all the time in Christian stuff today, right? The Christians are being persecuted. You hear this all the time. If you go to any church, well, they'll talk about it. The Christians are being persecuted worldwide by various organizations. But this 6 million Jew number actually came out in 1918. And I believe it's called the something like the New York Sun paper, something like that. And what they were doing is they were trying to create fundraising. There's a fundraising project where they were trying to raise money to save the Jews in 1918. And it went on for 2 decades until 1938, where this article just kept reappearing until the concentration camps actually existed. So this number, the 6 million number, had been thought of 2 decades before Hitler ever rose to power. And it never varied. It never increased. It never decreased. It was always 6 and then 6 zeros after it, right? And so that's a little suspect, right? That somehow someone had already thought about that number way before it ever occurred. And eventually 6.2 passed away. Now, one of our listeners has put a lot of effort into this, and he has discovered that the Census Bureau of Europe at the time, when they actually would, ask how many people live in a particular home and what's your nationality and that sort of thing, had come up with a number by 1935 that the total number of Jews living in Europe was 2.2 million, just a little over 2 million people. So we're missing about 4 million people in all of Europe that would be claiming to be Jewish. And I think that, some people would definitely choose not to answer, or they would perhaps lie out of repression or something like that. But the idea that more than 2/3 of them would lie is a little rough for the mind to believe, right? Now, again, I'm mentioning this because I want you to feel your rejection to everything I'm telling you. And this rejection is the thought police that you've actually already adopted in your system. Especially if you're Jewish. This will just really rile up all of your genes inside you, right? So this is an exercise in thought police. This is not an exercise in me trying to convince you of anything different. I'm just going to repeat what I have read. I really kind of come to the conclusion that my opinion can't really be certified in any way, shape, or form. So all I can do is take in the information and just consider it as a possible truth, a possible alternate truth that as opposed to what I've been bullied into believing. And we'll get into the laws in Europe to say you can't believe anything different. But you start getting to the concentration camps, Auschwitz and Dachau, and they started looking at the buildings that supposedly these individuals were gassed in. And scientists that really took a look at the way that the buildings were constructed, and they took a look at the properties of cyanide, which is heavier than oxygen, this gas that basically zaps your nervous system and kills you virtually instantaneously. They looked at the doors on the concentration camps and realized they weren't sealed. That when you close the front doors of any one of these gas chambers, that they didn't seal properly, bottom and top. In fact, you could put pieces of paper right through the door jambs. Even though they were locked, they weren't sealed at all. And then they looked at the height of the chimneys on top of these buildings and realized that if you were to put a gas in there like cyanide, that it would pop out of the chimney and it would run down the outside of the chimney and down to the ground, killing everyone outside. So we have a physical anomaly that the buildings that are currently exhibitioned every day in Europe to say that these were gas chambers couldn't possibly have been gas chambers unless everyone who's put in there was locked in there, and anyone who needed to operate the gas chambers would need to be completely covered head to toe. And I mean head to toe, because you can rub cyanide on yourself in a water-based form and you'll die instantaneously. There was a famous hitman called the Iceman, and he would put some sort of cyanide inside of a spritzer bottle, with just water, and he would take someone out for dinner. He'd pull the hamburger bun off, spritz out on the hamburger, and close it up. And it was contained in a water form, and the guy would eat his hamburger and die right in front of him. He claimed that was how he killed people multiple times. But the anomaly about this is that if they had pushed people in and turned on any sort of heavy gas, like a cyanide gas, that it would have leaked out the doors, it would have come out of the chimneys, it would have come out any of the window seals that weren't completely sealed up, and it would have killed anyone standing around the building. In addition, if they had managed to somehow remotely turn this on and be several feet away from this thing, probably nearly half a mile away from this thing, and they knew somehow when all the cyanide gas had diffused into the atmosphere so it wouldn't be lethal, when they would go back in the room and find these horrendous piles of bodies, that if you were to turn over a body, there'd be a pocket of gas in there that would kill the person that would turn over the body. So there was no way to vacate these concentration camps without actually killing themselves. So that's some of the physical scientific anomalies of claiming to have mass murdered people through gas chambers using exactly what they talked about using, which again is a cyanide gas derivative. In most cases, these sort of killing agents are heavier than air. So you'd always have this problem. And I know you might think that, well, maybe the doors were sealed way back in the day, but now they've eroded, and to our knowledge, that's not true in the slightest. There hasn't been any giant retrofitting of the doors. There isn't any, rubber molding that is worn off or anything like that. They don't have any. They're just like barns. There's other anomalies with disposing of the bodies, and the fact that 6.2 million bodies buried in any mass grave would still have amazing fossilized remains. Even if you were to cremate them, if any of you have cremated a relative, you'll know that the ashes that you get are partially the ashes. You don't get the entire body usually, and it has a lot of bone fragments in the ashes, and so those wouldn't go away over time. So we'd have mass graves where big blocks of biomatter would be completely researchable. You could actually pull someone's DNA out and take a hair from some memoir and put it together, and you find out that that was your father. And there definitely were mass graves, but nothing on the level of 6.2 million human bodies. So why mention this? I mention that because I can't think of a better place to go for us to all come to the same conclusion that regardless of the evidence, that is an area where we have been bullied into believing something. And what we always say on the show is that truth never needs to be bullied. Right? Truth is the truth, and you don't need to be pushed into it. Now, I promised I'd talk about some of the legislation. Americans are not raised usually with any knowledge of European laws. But what you need to understand is that there's laws on the books of Europe. I believe at least in Germany and Austria, you're not allowed to publicly deny any aspect of the Holocaust. You're not allowed by law to have a different thought other than the one that they have written into the history books. And remember, when Europe was completely saved by the British, the Americans, and then partially by the Russians, you have them writing all of the new laws about how it's going to operate. And again, if the agenda of the story of 6 million Jews started in 1918, just look it up on YouTube. Look up Holocaust 1918 and then 1938. You'll find a little video where a guy goes through all the newspapers and he just videotapes the newspapers and he goes through every single paragraph, reads every single sentence that's relative to this stuff, and your mind will blow a little bit because this agenda had been hatched, 20 years before Hitler ever rose to power. Now, one of their points about the concentration camps is they said that the reason why people died was out of sheer starvation, obviously murder, people, Nazis actually killing people because they either hurt them out of sheer spite or they thought that someone broke enough rules that they needed to kill them because they were disrupting the situation. But in the history books, even to this day, they had, because the Germans kept really good records of everything, they fed these people, they let them have, entertainment and that sort of thing. So there was all these weird protocols that were allowed in these camps that probably wouldn't have been allowed had they were just doing a mass slaughter, right? That's a little bit of fringy news on that. But they said that when they, just to finish up this evidence that has come out over the years, is that they said that when we found everyone and they were all emaciated, they said that that the Germans had been losing for so long in the war for a year or two straight, even though the history books were saying we were almost about to lose ourselves against these guys, that they were stretched so thin that they weren't able to actually supply any of the concentration camps with the proper amount of food or nutrients because the carpet bombing and the firestorm bombing that was going on by us against them to stop them had knocked out all their supply lines, so they could barely keep their soldiers fed and their citizens fed, let alone the folks that were being held as POWs. So that's how they account for a lot of the facts that they were the last people to be fed. Now, again, this isn't about me convincing you of anything, because I personally am just telling you what I've read and heard. I have no firm belief in anything in this area. But it's a place where we have probably the most focused amount of thought police in the planet is the Holocaust. Now, one could argue the next thing I'm about to go into might be even more intensely policed, but it's less violently policed. If politicians were to come out and repeat what I just told you, there's an anti-Semitic group which goes out and they persecute people that say they believe these things. I think David Duke is a politician, which I have no affiliation with or no loyalty to, but he's actually mentioned a lot of the stuff on videos as well, and he gets the anti-Semitic group. It's a pro-Jewish group that goes out and really attacks you on every front. And we'll get the rest of the people that aren't Jewish to hate you because you're questioning this story, which gives them the validity to start the country of Israel in a very sacred area of the world's history. Because there's a benefit to this rationale, right? We rationalize a country coming out of thin air on a piece of paper in the late 40s due to the persecution of the Jews by the Germans in Europe. And logic would say that if someone does you harm, that it's only the person who does you harm that should pay retribution to you, not folks that are completely uninvolved. So if you take the formation of Israel, one of the weirdest things is that you have an Arab-Jewish area, which is Israel at the time of the war's end in 1945, where you have Arabs and Jews completely cohabitating, your Palestinians and your Jewish community living hand in hand. They've been doing that for hundreds and hundreds of years. And all of a sudden, a piece of paper was signed by what's now the United Nations, and everybody certified it at the first country level, and that land was sequestered and given to the Jews as a reward, or not really a reward, but an amends to being persecuted by the Germans. When we had Germany completely cleared out, the Russians took one side, the east side, and the European, British and America took the west side. If nothing else, they should have been given that land and say, these were the people that supposedly killed a bunch of you folks, so you get all of Germany. There you go. There's a lot of Jews that were there, supposedly, right? 6 million Jews decided to live in Europe, so there's a big chunk for you right there. But instead, they pulled out religious documentation, right? Religious documentation which has no basis in historical reality. And they say, well, look, on this piece of paper right here, which we wrote for our people to believe, right? No one else believes this stuff but us. And maybe some Christians that want to tie themselves back to some more celestial beginning. The knowledge that they were there first, which is sort of this, no one can really say, I get your land because I was there first. You can't say that, because then the whole world would be mixed up like crazy, right? Native Americans lived here before white Europeans, and we think that they came from a mixture of various Polynesian and Asian races that came over to America prior to the white man. So does China and the Polynesians get total control over America because they could technically say genetically they were here first? It doesn't work like that in any other area of the world. But in this particular area of the world, a religious doctrine, which is made of, people with miracles and people who talk to God and people who are prophets that prophesize things that have never occurred, that's the documentation that was thrust on humanity to say this was our land first. Now, as soon as Israel was created, you have Arabs that had lived there for 1,000 years. They had 1,000 years of their relatives, farming the land and tilling. And again, their neighbors were Jewish, right? So you had a really good mix at the time. And now we have this incredibly bizarre situation where Israel's rolling over the Palestinian state. And they're getting rid of all the Arabs in the region. And so it becomes this tumultuous area of the world where there's always some sort of tension going on. And because Israel was formed on paper, which is very few countries in the world were ever formed on paper. Most countries had to fight to gain control over a piece of land, which is not necessarily a great alternative. But right now we have to constantly subsidize Israel because they're such a small state that they couldn't possibly defend themselves if the Arabs got together and pushed them off into the ocean, right? And this is going to continue forever until we can sort of figure out a balance for this whole thing. Right? I'm not sure the Arabs are ever going to accept the fact that Israel was just created out of thin air. And again, based on being persecuted by a bunch of people in Europe that had nothing to do with this Arab land. Again, I'm saying all this to rile you up, to rile up your bee's nest of thought police. So let's go back in time a little bit further to go after another area where there's thought police. And that's religion. I think that it's safe to say that an overwhelming majority of the planet Earth believes that Jesus Christ was a real person, that he came down from heaven in a virgin birth ceremony, that he lived approximately 31, 32 years or so, that he performed tremendous miracles, and that he ascended to heavens after being persecuted by the Romans. him being a Jew himself, right? He was turned in by the Jews to the Romans and persecuted and killed. Now, depending on if you're an atheist or an agnostic, your views in this area are going to be very different. But I think what's interesting is, and I'm not trying to convince you that something didn't exist or did exist. I'm trying to go at the gene inside your mind that's going to reject what I'm saying. And the more you're rejecting what I'm saying, the more I'm getting to my point, Most people feel very, very nervous about saying the following phrase: Jesus Christ never existed. He never existed, ever. Let that sink in for 1 second. Even say those words out loud and see if you don't have that thought police come into your system and go, boom. Most people, even historical theologians, right? They'll say, well, he most likely existed, but they'll say, oh, he's just a normal human being who was a religious prophet. He said all these things. They can't just say that he never existed, that the whole thing was constructed by the Roman Empire. Titus Flavius is one of the guys that's been heavily credited for perhaps creating the story of Christ, which the story of Christ and his individual accomplishments match in typology to Titus Flavius's real, actual documented life. Right? There's no physical evidence or documented evidence that Jesus existed in the first, 600 AD or before. But Titus Flavius, who lived in that area, who ended up being a Caesar, actually had this very similar life. And he had this battle with the Jews his entire life because the Jews were trying to get rid of the Roman Empire, thank God. But the Roman Empire had also reached a point where it had basically exceeded its ability to exist comfortably. They had expanded so much in the European lands that they didn't have enough legions to force people to be following the commandments of Caesar. And so they needed a system of belief in the mind of human beings that would self-police. And I think that's exactly what they created. We talk about on the show off and on, which is that the way that Rome could stay Rome and stay the dominating force in all of Europe was to pay their soldiers to do what they wanted them to do. And that took a lot of money, a lot of resources. And so they were always taxing all these different regions that they had conquered. Well, it was tough to send these legions out, to constantly come up with new Italian souls, to go out and run out and, put a spear in someone's face and say, do as Caesar says, otherwise die, right? Well, once this Christianity religion came about, we had a couple transformations in Europe. All the Caesars who had existed and all the senators that had existed underneath the Caesars turned into these religious deities. The very first incarnations of Christianity, we had several popes at one time, not just one. It's because all of those in power said, we don't mind the story of this Christianity thing, but we all want to have equal say. We don't want to have this new system of belief come about and we lose power. We lose our money trough of stealing the money from the people. Because just like today, when they send money out, the politicians grab it up or the warlords grab it up and that sort of thing. So they ended up creating a belief system by which people thought that God himself wanted them to give up 10% of their wages or more to the Pope, which used to be called Caesar. And so there's this interesting overlay between what was and what was very tough to maintain, the Roman Empire through sheer dominating force, and this new belief system that said that, no, forget Caesar, forget those guys. God wants you to do this. And it's not about making the legions rich or powerful. It's about God wanting you to reach him through this new Savior, through virgin birth, Jesus Christ. And consequently, again, we mentioned this several times, that there were many saviors like this prior to Jesus, at least 13 that we can trace. Some people have it up to 20, where we have a virgin birth. And it's a savior that saved the people. Ireland has its Cuchulainn, which is 2500 BC. Same thing, virgin birth saved Ireland. Didn't save the world, just saved Ireland, because that's all it needed to do was convince the people of Ireland to behave a certain way. In Egypt, there's a hieroglyph, which is the pharaoh and his queen sitting on the base of this thing, and above that is your Isis Horus statue above them having their child that is the virgin birth, which is born from the Son, right? It doesn't have any father. It just gets born, and then it becomes this anointed character that can tell us how things are working. And again, there's no problem with the value system that these religions come up with. They're actually very healthy for humanity up to a point. But again, thought police, think about it. You are conditioned to never say a lot of things I just said. I'm going after the jugular subject so that we can cut through the crap and feel the fact that we actually have these thought police mechanisms installed in us. So if you're a truther, hopefully I've still pushed your buttons. If you're a truther and you've researched any of the subjects that are typical for truthers, you will have looked at what we call false flags, which are government-sponsored terrorist acts that scare the people into tyranny. I'm assuming that most people that have listened to me, although we are gaining some new listeners here, have reviewed the official story of 9/11, and you realize that physics doesn't allow the buildings to fall based on the theory, the official story of just pancaking down. It would take almost 60 seconds for these things to fall per building if it was just impacts breaking the floors prior to the previous floors. You'd have to, once you study the architecture of those buildings, you realize that the buildings were actually constructed to withstand the top falling on the bottom. Inside the World Trade Centers, there were two lighter bands, which were service floors, and those service floors are called impact floors. And they were built perfectly to withstand the previous floors falling down to the impact zone. It wasn't going to fall anymore. So there's two bands that would have protected the buildings from actually fully collapsing down without explosives being attached to the building and making it liquefy, right? And that's just a huge rabbit hole I'm not going to go down into. But if you've been down that rabbit hole and you've started to realize, jets can't travel at 500 miles per hour at sea level, if you've studied the footage of the planes impacting the buildings and realized that all the Hollywood rotoscoping didn't work out right? You have background objects that became foreground objects as these planes were supposedly approaching the buildings, at least the second one. You'll start to realize, well, gosh, it doesn't seem to pan out. But there's this other force that says to you, well, okay, big shot, if you're not going to believe the indoctrinated thing that you've been taught to believe, then what actually happened? And if you can't supposedly come up with a brochure on everything, the schematics of how they did what they did and why they did it, supposedly you seeing something wrong with the story no longer can be admitted and no longer can be said. A lot of the thought police that occurs in the truther movement are these individuals that, again, are memorizers and repeaters. I always call them out because it's very important for them to maintain their accolades. Their accomplishment in life is storing a bunch of stuff in their brain and repeating it. If you're an accountant, for instance, you've learned all of the rules of accounting, what's permitted by law, the mathematics for calculating a balance sheet. And you've been able to live in the left brain and have a great life. Maybe you have $1 million mansion. Maybe you drive the Bentley. So for you, you're like, I am totally brilliant. And I'm totally accomplished. And these punks, these kids that are coming around saying that the world's a bad place. Screw those guys, right? We should take them all and put them in a concentration camp here in America, known as FEMA camps, right? Wesley Clark just came out and said that anyone who's disloyal to America should be jailed, right? You couldn't say a more subjective statement, because if that guy has to decide who's loyal, who's disloyal, we're talking about a military man that has been completely disassembled mentally in basic training and reassembled as whatever the military-industrial complex wants him to be. He's entirely rewarded in life for copying and following rules that have been set down for him. In terms of an individual with individual thought and an ability to process reality as it really occurs, he's the last guy on earth to be laying down any type of judgment on whether or not you're loyal or not. He's loyal to propaganda. So if you're not loyal to the propaganda that he's loyal to, then you're a disloyal person. And you're going to be subject, if he ever got his way, to being in a FEMA camp for the rest of your life. Thought police. It's big stuff. It's huge. Now, ridicule is a stabilizing mechanism for those that are into thought police. Now, I talked about the moon missions a minute ago, and I'm going to, for those of you who've heard everything I've ever said on the show, which is probably one or two of you, this will be old news, but in the context of thought police, I think it's very, very important, which is the following. In 1991, I moved to San Francisco from Los Angeles, and I was involved in a company that had 2 employees that were former NASA employees. And I was at a conference where we were showing off our software, and we needed to plug in a computer to the ground. And we weren't allowed to do it because there was a union that had guys that were electricians that paid $65 an hour in 1991, if you could think about that, over $130,000 a year to plug in shit into the ground. That we had to basically set up our computers and leave the plug literally right by the plug hole. I mean, this is how crazy the world's become, right? And we had to wait for the guy to get to our booth to plug it in so that we could test our software out, which was a huge, huge nightmare. And so we're sitting in there having lunch, waiting for the guys to plug in our computers. And I happened to utter the phrase, which I thought was so wise. I said, you think of if we could land a man on the moon, that we could plug our own computers into the ground. And my buddy, who had worked for NASA for, I think, about 15 plus years, he was a prodigy kid who ended up working for NASA after he graduated high school at 16. He looked at me and he had this really kind of weird grin on his face. And he said, "Oh, you think we did?" And I said, "What do you mean? You think we did? Think we didn't plug our computers in? What are you talking about?" And he goes, "You think we landed on the moon?" And I was a huge space kid, man. I mean, I studied that stuff like you wouldn't believe, and I got all these accolades at school for my little reports, oral reports, and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course we landed on the moon. And he turns to his buddy, which I didn't realize was one of his former NASA buddies, that he got the job at the company, and he said, "What do you think, man?" And this dude got really nervous, and he started looking over his shoulder, literally, just right in front of me, and he says, well, he wasn't as informed as the guy talking to me, but he said, well, if we did, I certainly couldn't figure out how we did. And the big guy turns and looks at me and starts debriefing me on the fact that we didn't go, and that both of them were on the Mars mission when it first got into its inception in the mid-'80s. And he said that when they were assigned to the Mars mission, they said, fine, let's go find out how we went to the moon, and then we'll take all that technology, boost it up, and get ourselves to Mars. But they couldn't find any. They couldn't find any evidence of how we got to the moon. They couldn't find any of the schematics for the Saturn V, for the booster rockets, or anything. And they kept getting all these blocking excuses that, they lost all the schematics of the Saturn V, which is a joke, right? I mean, you're talking about a multinational construct that everyone had schematics for because they're building modules and stuff like this. There's no way you would lose every duplicate of something so coveted, right? Especially the most historically amazing thing that man has ever done, which would, what I always say is you have the fire, the wheel, and going to the moon. Those are the 3 biggest accomplishments of mankind if we truly did ever reach the moon. But over the course of the next 15 to 30 minutes, he told me that he was debriefed that we didn't go, and that radiation was the huge problem. And the guy next to him had actually left about a year later, and he then tells me, he goes, yeah, he said that we found out that the solar radiation, forget the Van Allen belts, which encapsulate Earth. He said that just the solar radiation, without a flare or anything, he goes, that was so lethal that they were going to have to create a capsule that was encircled with 6 inches of water, which is an amazing insulator against radiation, just to keep astronauts alive floating in space without any disruption of any kind, meaning a coronal mass ejection or the Van Allen belts. And I heard all of this said to me by these authorities that were in the mix of the whole thing, and it didn't compute with me because I just simply couldn't have the thought in my mind. I had inadvertently worshipped the lie that we had gone. It was inspiring to me as a kid. So again, there's a lot of benefits to having believed that we went. There's a lot of benefits to fictional movies that we watch to inspire us to go do things that have never been done before. But this is one I wasn't ready for until in the kind of the mid-2000s. I had seen a video called by Bart Seabrel called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which then outlined and proved to us through videotaped evidence, released videos from NASA, someone trying to tell the story that we didn't go, that a lot of videos were shot out of sequence, that They actually had a whole 60-minute video of faking shots of the Earth. And they even had the very end sequence where they pulled this gel off a window and the guys all smirked to each other in the window. 60 seconds of that 54-minute video was the only amount that was ever aired on television. But someone leaked the whole 54-minute video, which is in his movie. So it wasn't until I saw it confirmed later on, and my mind had evolved into more of an adult mind that was less indoctrinated, that I could even see the evidence, right? Because I had been programmed by thought police to constantly deny anything that wasn't ridiculed. Now, the funny thing is, I got onto the moon thing because I want to talk about the ridicule mechanism to keep everybody in check. I have one of my favorite things I've ever done was the essay on tribalism. If you haven't heard it, it's not listened to that much, but I think it's one of the most profound things that I've ever said on an audio recording. So if you haven't, go to mkultraradio.com, search field, tribalism, have a listen. But in there I break down the fact that we have this instinctual tribalism to not be ejected by the tribe. Because let's face it, without a tribe to help us exist, to learn things that are unequivocally black and white truths, to get ahead in life and be happy in life, that we fail, Back in the day, it used to be, law of the jungle, so which meant the biggest guy in your village could sleep with all the women. He could beat up any guy. He had the biggest stick, and there was no way to get rid of the guy until people teamed up into a tribe and kicked his ass and said, anyone shows up that big, get rid of them because they're just going to be trouble, Well, the same thing happens when the people use ridicule against you. It kicks off that tribalism inside your body. The tribalism that can't be rejected. You don't want to be on the outside of the cool people. You don't want to be outside of the survival mechanism to exist. But once you fight off the thought police and you realize, screw that, I'm going to be my own man, my own woman, you start to gain incredible power over your own mind. And I think that every truther that's listening to me right now has their own story of when they stopped giving a crap about what society was going to call them. Now, I bumped into two people who work for NASA at super, I wouldn't say Q clearance, but really high clearance levels, who knew that the moon mission was fake. And I knew that they knew, one, because they couldn't tell me anything they were doing in NASA for one thing, but because of the way they reacted to me telling them across the dinner table, 2 different occasions, 2 different people, they don't know each other. And I very carefully said, did they tell you that we didn't go to the moon? In so many words. And the first thing out of their mouth was this ritualized ridicule, where they said, in fact, one guy said something like, anyone who doesn't believe that went to the moon is just an asshole. Well, the guy said for something very similar, but then he said, is an idiot, in more poignant terms, right? Always curse words. It's very interesting. And so I let them get that out of their system. And what they're doing is, what's funny, the ritual that I found, and I wish I could do this again being 10 years older from the last time I did it, as I just look them in the face and I kind of let it get that out of their system, because they're looking to have a reaction with me to see if I'll cower down to popular thought. But then I look them right in the face and I say, look, I was debriefed by someone who was debriefed. I'm not asking you if we went to the moon. I'm telling you we didn't go. And once they have that eye-locking, I'm not believing your bullshit tactic against me, the whole facade wears off instantaneously. And one of the guys had the courage to smile at me really funny. And he's like, okay. And I said, we proceeded to have a kind of a really weird roundabout conversation. And what I found out was that I had more knowledge than the first guy I talked to about it. And he sort of didn't want to get into it because they have this obedience, right? The people who are allowed into the circles, other than my 2 buddies that debriefed me, was that you have to be a loyalist. They give you psychological tests to make sure that you don't have an original thought, that you're not going to buck the system. Everybody in the intelligence agencies of the lower part of the pyramid, nationwide, internationally speaking, they interview you for months to make sure you have no original thought. And these kids come home and they brag about how they're going to get into these organizations, and I'm sitting there looking, I'm like, you're just bragging about the fact you don't have any discernible thought of your own, which is real interesting, right? The second guy I talked to, was very interesting because he did the same exact thing, called me a bunch of names, sort of roundabout why. He said, anybody thinks that. I just told him I thought that. And he goes, well, if anyone thinks that, there are all these bad things. And he held his poker face for a little while. And I finally just said, well, we've got all these incredible disk arrays, which are these huge, telescope arrays in the desert that can look deep into space and see all these crazy, galaxies out there. And I said, if we have spy satellites that can read newspapers on Earth in the early 80s, which is another part of my background of working with people that actually worked on that software, I said, I know for a fact that we could turn the Hubble telescope or something and point it at the moon and get all of the photographs of everything on the moon. And not just some crappy little photograph that NASA actually has published right now, which is a really far away picture of the Earth with this little dot on there. It's supposed to be the lunar lander. Again, I've got better footage of my backyard from Google Earth than we have of the moon missions, right? But every single object on the moon, every single terrain that they faked, should be in photographic proof via these spy satellites that we've done to survey the world and suppress us, right? And once I said, hey, we should be able to get that shot via telescopes, the guy smiled at me, and he finally cracked at that point. He just said, yeah, that does make a lot of sense, doesn't it, right? He just looked at me like, that's as much as you're going to get out of me in terms of agreeing with you that we didn't go to the moon. Thought police. It's absolutely everywhere. And when you watch the news, a lot of times, thought police is very subtle. Thought police will be defending the two-party system. If you're a libertarian, for instance, which I'm nothing, I'm a constitutionalist, if anything, and a fan of the republic, the concept of a republic, which is not Republican, right? It means you have inalienable rights that can't be taken away from you, Magna Carta, Constitution. They'll ridicule that you would ever vote for anyone else different than the left and right paradigm. When right now, as of July 22nd, 2015, we have both sides of the hill, the Republicans and the Democrats, voting for banning the labeling of genetically modified foods. Both sides. The president's going to sign it off if it ever gets through the House and the Senate. They operate as one. But if you watch Fox News, they'll ridicule you for being a liberal. If you watch CNN, they'll ridicule you for being a conservative and not being part of their party. It's all thought police to construct this reality, which supposedly we're all going to get along by, Now let's take an example of the positive, where thought police died for short stints in human reality. If anyone looks at America, let's say 1953, and I could teleport you back through a time machine, you could walk around anywhere in America and study the culture and the belief systems of America in 1953, you're going to have a tiny, minuscule amount of rock and roll that's started kind of seeping out, where white guys started playing black guys' music, and a couple of the black guys were able to actually get their music on the radio. But as soon as Elvis Presley came along, you have this explosion of rock and roll. And what ended up happening was, and again, I wasn't alive at this time, so I'm going to paraphrase what I think occurred in interviewing people that lived through this era in as much detail as I could. You had people that were tired of being repressed, tired of the rule systems that were on them, that were imposed on them without a purpose. And anytime you have a rule system imposed on you without a purpose, that's where the youth of the world and society in general tries to reject it eventually, because they're like, look, you didn't give me a reason why I got to behave or whatever. You had this revolution in thought. When the Beatles came around in the early 60s, if you watch the audiences of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, for that matter, you have girls behaving in the most crazy, lunatic manners. I mean, you have kids just disintegrating inside the audience when their rock star came on the stage. And you don't see that anymore, right? You have people that are very excited to see their favorite rock stars or whatever. But back in those days, you were seeing this repression pop out of those girls, because the women of America were very, very repressed to have a certain role in the world, and they felt that need to push out and be an individual. So the rock and roll industry was a way for them to punch out of their system. And it was so pent up their whole lives, that they couldn't control themselves. They wept at the notion of being with these rockers and being in a new world and worshiping these lyrics, which were just goofy lyrics at the time, right? Kind of like love story things. But all the love stories were them vicariously living this new imaginary life in their mind that they wanted to have, right? And then we had this substance that was dropped on America called LSD. And, my research indicates that, if you watch history channels and you listen to official stories, you have the mob, which actually brought a lot of drugs over from Europe and started marketing it into America. But about 1949 to 59, you had the CIA that was actually tracking all these mobsters and where they were growing it in South America and how they were refining and how they were selling it. Kind of the game to create liquid cash, right? Because the CIA wanted liquid cash too, to do what they needed to do. So right about the time that the Kennedy boys came in, you had this takeover where the CIA was starting to go after all the mob bosses, and that's where you get RFK, Robert Kennedy, kind of being put on the tip of the spear to be the kind of the kingpin that was going to pull all this off. And of course, he got all the accolades for pulling it off in historical history. But in the end, it was the CIA that was behind him that had all of the research prepared for him to just stand at the front and say, these bad guys need to go. Of course, it took him about 20 years to pull these guys off the street and take it over. But mysteriously, we had this drug that was invented in the 30s called LSD dropped into the populace, and they did all those tests on kids, and you have all these videos of kids taking LSD, and people were being enlightened all of a sudden. They were seeing the universe as it might truly exist. They were seeing love. They were feeling love. And it started to have a profound effect on society, but it was just barely trickling in the early 60s, right? And it wasn't until the late 60s that we had this hippie movement where people started to take enough of this stuff. And again, I've taken it a couple times, and I think that you don't really need to pound LSD. It's not a drug you need to take multiple times. In fact, the people that have taken, buckets of this stuff really kind of come to the conclusion in the end, you only need to really take it once when you're of right mind, right? If you got a bunch of skeletons in your closet, you don't want to take it because you might have a really weird trip. But they started losing control of the populace, especially when they were fighting this Vietnam War, which was an absolutely senseless war, right? And they had a problem on their hands. Society was starting to love each other. And again, it was mostly America and maybe a handful of Europeans that were doing it. So we're the war machines for the bankers of Europe. It's our kids that go over and destroy regions to be taken over by the IMF. See Economic Hitman if you have any questions about that, which is a book that talks all about the takeover of South America by the CIA. But eventually, LSD became this extremely illegal drug when it has no side effects, despite television today. It doesn't make you crazy, right? It doesn't make you run off like alcoholics that beat their children and beat their wives, which is legal, right? LSD will calm your shit down, let you see the world in so many dimensions. It's incredible. You get a lot of these tales of seeing hallucinations, right? Where you could see your hand melt or something like that. And the couple times I've taken it, I've never seen anything like that at all. I've just seen a couple little apparitions that didn't exist. But overall, what ended up occurring was that I started seeing dimensions of my own belief systems that I had never seen before. Just looking at the sun becomes this beautiful mathematic geometry in your mind. But it became apparent to me why this would be the most illegal drug in America. And there's one that's slightly more illegal than that, which is called DMT, which they call the dream molecule. DMT is something that we create in our mind every night when we go to sleep. It exists in most things in nature, and they distill it out of like tree bark, as a matter of fact. But the government did a tremendous amount of experiments on this, and you have these really super intense experiences. I mention LSD because we're on the subject of thought police. And I'm not trying to get you guys to go out and take an illicit drug and get yourself in trouble, even possessing this stuff, because if you're caught possessing it, it's unbelievable. They put you in jail for 15 years when it is probably the safest drug you could possibly ever take. The guy who invented it dropped nearly a beaker on his hand when he was formulating this stuff and had a massive trip for a couple days. But they'll tell you that you can OD on it and end up in a funny farm the rest of your life, right? which I'm not sure is actually true. If it is, you probably took something else in addition to it, right? But we have this pressure on waking up to keep us from waking up. And that's why everything that makes us destructive and paranoid is legal, and everything that wakes up our consciousness is illegal. And that should matter to you. I believe it's Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan's show have talked a lot about taking various ayahuasca and LSD drugs, which, David Icke is known for taking some ayahuasca derivative and talking to a voice for 13 hours, and that's how he came up with this whole thing. He was Jesus Christ and that sort of thing. So you can't go off the deep end if you're not careful, but perhaps he misinterpreted what he was being told. Perhaps it was just you're a divine being in the universe, and so was everybody else, right? But in terms of a mechanism to fight it in the modern age without a drug, I want you to be cognizant of when someone tells you that you're not allowed to have a thought. Now, obviously, there's perverted thoughts where people get off and they become serial killers, they become rapists, they become pedophiles. I'm not talking about that. Those people have been damaged somehow in life, and their value system is heavily, heavily skewed, and it's based on the suffering of others brings the pleasure to them, right? We need to identify those people very quickly and get them off the streets and put them in institutions to rehabilitate them, or just sit on them until they croak, right? Because they've got issues. And I think society's unfortunately run by a lot of these people, because if you wanted to do things that were illegal, you want to be above the law. And that is why when we see police videos where they take a black woman who forgot to signal, and she's pulled over by a southern white cop, and he pulls her out and later kills her at the jail, and we let that go by. Well, she was a black woman, right? Some people are racist internally, like, well, whatever. Well, that's you. She's you. And for her, it was death. Luckily the DA is investigating that particular one as a homicide, as a murder. But a lot of times it doesn't get reported as a murder, and when we allow a faction of the universe to become, in our own minds, higher than us, then we've created an imbalance in our own world that is very lethal and dangerous. Kyle and I have a problem with the Pope being held up as a deity who has a special relationship with God, special permissions from God to act down onto humanity. So all these articles that come out that praise any one pope, it doesn't matter which one it is, and he's somehow got this authoritative moral authority over man, that we need to listen to this guy over us, when that institution has protected tens of thousands of pedophiles from ever being persecuted in a court of law. Even when the evidence is completely proven, it's the wrong guy to be listening to. I want to get you to the point you can listen to your own consciousness, make up your own mind about things. And again, as long as you harm no one else, you give more than you take, I think you're going to be okay. But we have to be careful about this sort of induction of political correctness, because my own mother chastised me once because I mentioned it to her, 15 years ago, that political correctness is out of control. And she immediately went into this defense mechanism, which was that somehow I want to be an asshole to everyone because I don't want to adopt the latest phrase for what is not going to be offensive. She said, well, I don't think people should be offensive. So you're defending people being offensive. Again, like the word retarded being used for someone who's mentally handicapped, right? I'm using the other phrase that's okay. And again, if we have this infinite conversation and a political correctness conversation, then mentally handicapped is eventually going to be demonized, because I need to keep the mechanism in your mind that the new generations have to renew all the nomenclature, because if we don't demonize what they use as words, we don't create the doublespeak mechanism in the brain. And that's the objective. That's why political correctness never settles down. A word is always eventually demonized because we have to deny its existence in our brain to create a new one, a new thought in our mind. And we need to end this lunacy right now. There are words that are obviously never meant to be clinically used, right? Retarded was a medical term that was used. I think that the racist war that's being incubated here in America is really struggling to stay alive. In some cases, it's really easy for people to constantly keep this going, but in the end, we have a problem with how to address each other for different races. You know, a white guy's never going to get offended by be calling a white guy, but there's no term that a white person can address, say, a black person, without running the risk that that person is going to choose the word that you're using to feel like it's a negative thing. You know, we use African American now to be as clean as possible, but I guarantee you in 20 years, somehow African American is going to be the wrong thing to say, because someone's going to say, you know, I wasn't born in Africa. I'm an American. You know, my lineage built this country. Stop calling me African. You know, most blacks in America have a lot of white in their blood. So completely calling them one race is even potentially offensive once they start thinking about the fact that they've been blended like all of us, right? I'm not just German. You know, I'm British and German. I'm sure I got a little slice of Irish and Scottish, which is sort of the same bloodlines mixed together. I might even have some Jewish in my blood based on one of my grandfathers. So, but I'm not looking to be offended when I'm being addressed. You know, whatever makes you feel comfortable with addressing me, as long as we're not going to talk about slang. You know, there's the N-word, which I don't think has ever been meant to be anything but offensive, which I guess the word means lazy person. And I always think it was very interesting that a plantation owner would ever use the N-word against his workers. When he's sitting in the shade on a porch drinking lemonade and they're out there working, he's calling them lazy people. Isn't that interesting? So to conclude and sort of wrap this up, this has been, obviously, for some of you, a very acidic episode to listen to, and if you even made it to the end of this, then you are most likely very healthy in the realm of not being a victim to thought police. But for those of you who can hear my voice right now, it means you made it to the end. We are going to have to be the bigger people in the universe to try and dismantle this thought police within our own practices first. And then maybe in our closest loved ones who, again, have been conditioned to be offended constantly, right? There's this, I talk about a lot on the show, and I'll repeat it here just because it's in good context. There is a sickness that fuels this thought police, which is being offended. I was at a party the other day where someone was saying something that could be construed as offensive to me, which I could give a crap. And they weren't trying to point it at me, but they were trying to validate themselves through some really ridiculous associations. And so as a quip, as a joke back, I threw out another like-minded association, which was ridiculous. And it was a conversation about I live in Orange County, and this person lived in Los Angeles, and she had said something sort of diminutive about Orange County people, that were bad people. And so I called her on it just as a joke. I don't give a crap, right? She didn't really mean it in any negative way, but she kind of validated herself by saying, oh, I have friends in Anaheim, right? It's that old thing to say, that it's the beautiful scarab beetle that flies around once in a while. But she said that, you know, I know Anaheim people. And I looked at her and I said, well, I know black people, you know, and boy, she got all offended, right? I heard a couple moans in the crowd, right? And I was like, people, that's the exact thing she just did. She tried to say she knows people in Orange County, so therefore she doesn't dislike Orange County, right? And it's every white person that tries to say something negative, perhaps about Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson, who I think are just ridiculously atrocious people, they'll try to validate themselves. Well, I got black friends, you know, and he wants to say they don't quite, you know, agree with the gay agenda. They'll say, well, I got gay friends, you know. And we're guilty of that on the show, too. And kind of I talk about all the time where there's this knee-jerk thing to supposedly make sure that people understand that you're not against something, that you're part of that, you know, you're completely accepting of that other crowd. And so I think that, you know, we mentioned Morgan Freeman on our last podcast about the fact that he said the way to get rid of racism is to stop talking about it, you know. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I think that I'm not going to encourage you to go back out and start calling mentally handicapped people retards, right? That's never going to work. I want you to be aware of the fact that that whatever words you're using for things right now, which are those sensitive areas. What do you call a Native American? What do you call an African American? What do you call someone who's not, able to walk? Be aware. You want to make good choices such that you can live a nice life and not offend people. But in your own mind, just realize what's happening. Realize that you are potentially compromising your interior thought mechanisms to satiate others. And again, the offensive mechanism is that someone gets a reward for being offended. And there's a big addiction to that right now. Again, if I can prove to you I've been offended, then you got to treat me good for a little while, get this little reward because I've convinced you that you've somehow touched me poorly, right? As we like to say in MK Ultra, adults don't get offended. If you're getting offended habitually, that means you're still a child. Sorry to say it, but that's the God honest truth. Pity those who would offend you. If you're going to go for offense in your mind, just turn around and pity that person that they're just not that well developed. But in the end, make sure that it's something real. Make sure that it's something that is actually truly remotely offensive and not just one of these PC platforms that people are trying to live on to govern how your brain develops. The internet is still online right now. Potentially there might be some cataclysmic event, either natural or false flag natural, and we'll lose this apparatus. We'll lose this ability to talk to each other. And if that were to ever occur and you were able to hear my voice right now, then you'll be telling your grandkids, well, once upon a time there was this guy online that said this, and you guys will never hear him say it because just like Escape from Los Angeles, they EMP the whole planet and it's gone, right? They'll blame it on a coronal mass ejection. Meanwhile, David Rockefeller will be playing his PlayStation 52 up in his Iron Mountain, right? So I think you feel me. We need to make sure that we own our minds 100%. You're going to have to play this duality game between your brain and your mind and your ideas and your thoughts and the political correctness circus that's going on the outside. But if you shut off the arteries and fail to give the Nielsen ratings to these news organizations, fail to give the web traffic to these organizations that go online, you'll greatly impact their ability to proliferate and make profits and exist in our world. They'll be subsidized for a little while, but what we've learned about the ruling classes, they don't like to part with any of their money. They are absolutely diseased with their greed. And if in order to keep this pressure up on us, they have to get rid of their own gold, they won't do it. They'll give up, and they'll try to incubate a new way to convince us to fight each other and hate each other. And again, if we just constantly reject it, we win. We talked about broadcast speak on the news. They talk to you in a completely juvenile way that somehow you can't possibly understand what they're saying until they break it down for you. We have to kill this. We have to just stop absorbing it for one reason. So turn your televisions off when it comes to taking in reality from your television. Anytime you watch a show, make sure you're filtering what you're seeing. I saw a very interesting thing happen the other day. I was sitting down with a friend and watching a show on TV, and it was some old, cop worshiping show, forensics show. This team of demographics was cracking cases, right? And the episode started with a father and a son driving down a street driving down an old country road in the middle of the night. And the father thought he saw a deer, and he swerved away from it. And the kid's like, "What did you swerve from?" And he goes, "Oh, didn't you see the deer?" And the kid's like, "No, I didn't see a deer." And because he swerved, he punctured the tire, and he had to pull over and fix his flat tire. And he gets out of the car to fix the flat tire, and he starts seeing like these ninjas popping out of the woods. And so he starts swinging the tire iron around, trying to fight these apparitions that his kid's not seeing. And he told his child to stay in the car. And so our brain says, oh, he's in the car. And then eventually he turns around towards the car and he sees this really weird apparition that's even stranger, right? And he beats the living crap out of it. And it turns out that his son left the car and was trying to stop his father from swinging the tire iron at nothing. So he nearly kills his son with a tire iron. And of course, in the next scene, they show a picture of the child dead, really, and then they go, well, he's going to live, but he's going to be in the hospital for weeks and weeks and weeks. So a father beats his child with the tire iron. In the next scene, the forensics team comes in and then accuses the father in the scene of being on LSD. Right? That total PCP alcoholic drug known as LSD, right? The safest, most love-inducing, universe-in-touch drug in the world is being demonized on television as being this drug that will make you kill your kid. Now, I didn't watch the rest of the episode because I blurted out in the room how much crap that was, and the person watching turned the TV off and got mad at me for saying something about how bullshit that LSD correlation was. And maybe the whole plot is that it wasn't LSD, right? But the guy the homeless guy that ate the guy's face off in Florida was actually blamed on LSD, a bad batch of LSD, which is utterly ridiculous. But what was funny about the whole thing was that the TV wasn't turned off when a father beat his son with a tire iron. That was okay. That was perfectly acceptable viewing material. And being a father myself, I know that if my daughter ever watched that show when she was young, she would look at me completely different. Like, my God, are you going to do this to me? You're going to beat me with a tire iron? I thought it was horrific that sort of storyline would be on a family show, which is some cop-worshipping show, right? But again, it's never turned off of that. It's turned off when someone says that the love drug of the universe is being blamed for one of the most hideous acts on earth, when we know every single day on any news organization globally, drunks are doing that exact thing to their families. They're massacring their families. They're shooting all their family members. They're shooting themselves in the end because they're cowards. And that's what alcohol does. But that's a legal drug that people worship every single day. But it's never accused of anything, because who's going to sponsor that show if you demonize alcohol? There's not going to be any Budweiser commercials between that. Those commercial breaks is there. And if you're an alcohol worshiper, you definitely wouldn't allow your religion to be accused of what it's always responsible for. Thought police, right? Thought police, thought police, thought police. It's everywhere. So I want you to be heightened that you have thought police no matter who you are. I have it. But we need to work every single day to make sure it's not demonized. That it is demonized, and that our thinking is not demonized. I know you feel me. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. This is Deep Thoughts, episode 11. For those of you who are getting this on the podcast, these are videotaped and they are on YouTube if you want to see my mug and my amazing hand gestures. If you haven't already, go to mkultraradio.com. From there, we have over 100 episodes. We have each one of these Deep Thought episodes in a particular tab across the top. If you haven't joined our Facebook group, please do. Again, the cool thing about this is people ask us how to filter the news. And we do filter the news for you on Facebook. So we take these articles that we think you should read, or the propaganda that's being pushed, and we put little taglines above to help you really see between the lines of what's actually being reported. Again, we're not Democrats, we're not Republicans, so if you're loyal to those two groups, you will definitely be offended. But if you're being offended, that means you're suffering a big, giant case of thought police. And the second you're not offended, the second you live for the human race, you're going to find a sweet place to live on the internet. So as we always say on the show at the very end, learn the rules that rule you. And what we mean by that is that you're living by those rules regardless if you know them or not. Remember, the truth is always the truth regardless if you want to accept it or not. So get in the know, get into the truth. We don't have all the answers. We're not always right, but we're archaeologists trying to find the pure human condition that lives in complete truth. And remember, truth predicts the future, and everything else is a lie. Thanks for listening. Over now.